Build One South Africa has decried what it says is a failure by the Department of International Relations and Cooperation to condemn the human rights abuses in government by the ANC's longtime ally in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF. This is all ahead of the upcoming 44th SADC summit set to be held in Zimbabwe's capital city, Harare, this coming Saturday. DIRCO stated that they're monitoring the situation and called for a dialogue to resolve the political challenges. BOSA leader Mmusi Maimane joins us for more. Getting his reaction. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. DIRCO is saying that they are monitoring the situation and they're calling for a dialogue to resolve the political issues. What's your take on what we heard this afternoon insofar as the responses when it comes to ensuring that this summit doesn't happen in Harare?
Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. Zimbabwe is in a deep crisis. And that crisis is fundamentally because the opposition there has been treated like criminals in a country of their birth, where they feel they have convictions to fight for the people of Zimbabwe. Opposition members have been arrested, some disappearing, and this is not a recent thing. It has happened as far back as when President Robert Mugabe was president.
And I think this is the reason why it's a good thing for this SADC summit to be held in Zimbabwe. I know that people like Mmusi Maimane, they are totally against the idea of SADC summit being held in Zimbabwe because of all of these allegations that are facing ZANU-PF. But me, as a South African, I think it's a good thing that this summit is held in Zimbabwe. Why? Because all eyes are on Zimbabwe right now. People are having conversations about what's happening in Zimbabwe. People are having conversations about the kind of treatment that the people of Zimbabwe are getting from their own government. So maybe this is what the people of Zimbabwe needed. Maybe this is what we as fellow Africans actually need, because people are looking at their own governments and saying, guys, you remember not so long ago, the SADC mission team went to Zimbabwe and said that the Zimbabwean elections could not meet the threshold to be declared free and fair. Why are you supporting this? As for us here in South Africa, this is the same thing that we were outraged about. Do you remember how outraged the South Africans were when they learned that President Ramaphosa will be in Zimbabwe to support the inauguration of Mnangagwa after the SADC mission team said the elections in Zimbabwe could not meet the threshold to be declared free and fair? So maybe this is exactly what the people of Zimbabwe needs. Maybe this is what the country needs, and maybe this is what all of us actually need, so that we can amplify what's happening in Zimbabwe. I think if they take the summit away from Zimbabwe, it is not going to benefit us in any way. But if the summit stays in Zimbabwe, people are going to have conversations about Zimbabwe. Just like right now, as we speak, people are debating about this summit being in Zimbabwe. Why? Because of the treatment that the people of Zimbabwe are getting from their own government. So personally, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that SADC summit must be held there in Zimbabwe over the weekend, so that people can criticize SADC and so that people can criticize the government of Zimbabwe for subjecting their own citizens under terrible conditions.
This summit doesn't happen in Harare.
Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. Zimbabwe is in a deep crisis. And that crisis is fundamentally because the opposition there has been treated like criminals in a country of their birth, where they feel they have convictions to fight for the people of Zimbabwe. Opposition members have been arrested, some disappearing, and this is not a recent thing. It has happened as far back as when President Robert Mugabe was president. So a simple statement by the South African government saying it is observing a situation where even when elections were held in Zimbabwe, the SADC Observer Mission declared that those elections were not free and fair.
Of course.
I think is a dereliction of duty by South Africa. It is ultimately a turning a blind eye to a crisis of injustice. And no dialogue is going to resolve a violation of human rights. And therefore, I want to call and urgently state that it is time, given that we're in a state of a government of national unity, a new posture as South Africa, that in fact we move and refuse to not only participate in the SADC, but to ultimately have it moved to a country upon which human rights are upheld.
You speak about the government of national unity, but we know that South Africa has proven, I mean, you make mention of the election outcome as an example, that it refuses to take a tougher stance on Zimbabwe. Even with negotiations that took place with former President Thabo Mbeki, it pretty much is still the same thing that we're witnessing today. What are your expectations in terms of the posture and the position that the government of national unity should be taking on this matter, given the history and the kind of tippy-toeing South Africa has shown to Zimbabwe?
It is not South Africa, it is the ANC. It is not South Africa, it's the ANC. As long as the ANC is part of the government, South Africa will always tiptoe around the issue of Zimbabwe. That is a fact. Other political parties in the country, they don't have a problem saying that what's happening in Zimbabwe is totally unacceptable and we are not going to support that. Other political parties, they have no problem with saying that. But the problem is the ANC. The problem is the ANC because the ANC, they are friends with ZANU-PF. These people, they come a long way with ZANU-PF. So this is the reason why they've been tiptoeing around this issue of ZANU-PF. The ANC doesn't even care with the fact that when it comes to these issues of the human rights, they are totally exposed because these are the same people that are trying to present themselves as the activists of the human rights. They are making a lot of noise about what's happening overseas, about the people of Palestine and how the human rights of the people of Palestine are being abused. But at the same time, they say nothing about the human rights of the people of Zimbabwe, the fact that millions of Zimbabwe are scattered all over the world because of the regime that is governing Zimbabwe. So the ANC alone, when it comes to the issue of the human rights, they have been totally exposed, but they don't care because ZANU-PF, it is their friends. So the only way South Africa can actually take a different posture when it comes to what's happening in Zimbabwe, it's if the ANC is no longer part of the government. As long as the ANC is part of the government, South Africa will always tiptoe around the issue of Zimbabwe.
I think ultimately we need a change of positioning here. We cannot be selective in where we choose to condemn violations of human rights.
The ANC doesn't care about being selective. They don't care about being selective. And this is what people have been saying for the longest time, that guys, man, you see this fight that you are trying to take on of the human rights, maybe it's best if you just ignore all the human rights violations that are happening in the world. Because if you are going to say nothing about what's happening in your neighbor, but go to Middle East, go to Europe to complain about the human rights violations that are taking place there, ultimately you look like a fool. You look like a fool. And the ANC, man, at this point, they don't care. They are just being selective.
We cannot be selective in where we choose to condemn violations of human rights. We need to be consistent as a country. And that's the reset that at the very least this government can take. We must restore that what is an ANC-ZANU-PF relationship cannot be synonymous with a South African government and parliamentary responsibility as it speaks to the issue of Zimbabwe. We will tomorrow lament the fact that there is immigration that is taking place by Zimbabweans into South Africa. We will lament many things. But actually the beginning point would have been the stabilization of Zimbabwe. A stable Zimbabwe is good for South Africa, but it is not going to be stable if we are turning a blind eye to the issues that are taking place there. And therefore, I really believe there's an opportunity here for us to stand strong, stand for human rights, make a bold declaration. When even prior to these elections, when President Ramaphosa attended the inauguration, I thought to me was a betrayal of SADC because already there was a declaration that the elections were not free and fair. Now is an opportunity to reset all of that. And there's a massive opportunity and a burden of responsibility for South Africa to uphold here, where it in fact must be the ones who look after human rights. Botswana goes to elections next. Are we going to sit back and watch if any of violations take place in the same country? We cannot be selective in our condemnation of human rights. And therefore, I would call on Minister Ronald Lamola, the President of South Africa, and the South African Diplomatic Corps to stand strong and simply reject the fact that what is going on there is correct, stay away from the summit, or have it moved to a different country where human rights are upheld.
They are not going to do that. They are not going to do that. There's no way. There's no way the ANC is going to do that. They are not going to do that. But at the same time, it's a good thing that Mmusi Maimane is actually asking them to do this, because at the same time he knows that they are not going to do this. At the end of the day, they are the ones who will be exposed. So Mmusi Maimane, he knows very well what he's doing. He knows very well what he's doing, that these people will never condemn. They will never condemn. They will never say that the summit must be moved to a country where human rights are actually respected. They know the ANC will never say that. And knowing that the ANC will never say that, they are actually giving you an opportunity to expose them, which is exactly what Mmusi Maimane is doing over here.
What do you make of the notion that that cannot happen because South Africa fears an influx of Zimbabweans entering the country, so they're trying to keep as much stability as they can while tippy-toeing around this matter? Is that excuse valid enough? I mean, I've just spoken to an expert in the space saying that he suspects that's pretty much one of the reasons why South Africa hasn't taken a much tougher and bolder stance in condemning Zimbabwe.
The only way to restore the credibility of Zimbabwe is to allow for democracy to thrive. That's about, as I've alluded to, holding free and fair elections, but actually allowing the opposition to exist. This is something that is South Africa. I must applaud the ANC for having upheld in our country, where if you are in the opposition of any kind, you are allowed to say and do what you'd like, mobilize as you want. Zimbabwe must enjoy the same right. Why can't we fight for it there? Because when the people of Zimbabwe feel that the election results are free and fair, that their opposition leaders can be able to stand up and be able to operate as freely as they can, it's only then and then only can you stabilize the country. You can build an economy that works. You can have ultimately constitutional democracy being held in Zimbabwe. That's one of the ways. Because when I speak to Zimbabweans who are in South Africa, many of them would much rather be in their own country of birth. Exactly. Because they want to be closer to their family and to the systems that work in Zimbabwe. Very few citizens actually immigrate in this particular instance because they have some form of ulterior desire for South Africa. They want to live in a country that is prosperous.
Oh, exactly, man. And I think the ANC, they are just okay with the fact that the South Africans are just criticizing Zimbabweans for coming to South Africa and all sort of things, instead of looking at the root cause. Most of Zimbabweans would actually prefer to live in their own country. They are here because of what's happening in Zimbabwe, because of the treatment they are getting from their own government. But in South Africa, this is not what we are talking about. We are just criticizing these people and saying how these people need to live without actually looking at the root cause. So the ANC actually enjoys the fact that people are simply being what's the word? They are simply being ignorant when it comes to the root cause of having so many Zimbabweans inside of South Africa. So if South Africans can actually start having conversations amongst themselves, this is where we are actually going to reach a consensus and saying that, guys, these people, man, do not want to confront what's happening in Zimbabwe. And this is the reason why Zimbabweans have actually decided to come to South Africa. As much as we would like to say everything, all of these things to these people, but you as an individual, man, if you lived in a country where you cannot even express your own opinion, if you were living in a country where you are not even allowed to support an opposition party, you see, like, you would also try to flee the country to live in a country where you can actually have a better chance of becoming a better someone tomorrow. So they are just enjoying the fact that South Africans are being ignorant when it comes to the root causes of why Zimbabweans are here from the first place. Because many of us, we tend to think that these people, they simply enjoy being in South Africa, or they love coming to South Africa. It's good being in South Africa, but truth of the matter is that these people, they are fleeing from something there in Zimbabwe.
We must give them that right to do so. And the best way to stem the immigration tide is to stabilize Zimbabwe and ensure that it is a prosperous country, which it can be. So South Africa's posture that simply says, no, well, if we allow democracy to fail in Zimbabwe, we hopefully will be able to secure our border sufficiently that Zimbabweans cannot come in, would be a simple misnomer and a poor strategy. I would suggest that it hasn't worked since the Zimbabwean government of national unity. Now is the time for us to, in fact, reset that relationship, be strong on Zimbabwe, and make it unequivocal that we are not going to tolerate violations of human rights. Even if it wasn't about immigration, a fellow African being killed by Africans is a violation of the very principle of Ubuntu and solidarity and must be condemned by all peace-loving and democracy-loving Africans.
What do you think in terms of the messaging, given the position by South Africa? What does it send to the rest of the world with South Africa's position on this matter?
That we are hypocrites. That is the only message that it sends to the world, that South Africans are nothing but hypocrites who would make noise about what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Middle East, and not saying anything about what's happening in Africa. This is the reason why, man, it is so weird, man, when you look at these African head of states making so much noise about what's happening in the Middle East and saying nothing about what's happening in Africa, man. Like, it is super weird. Super weird. So people outside, when they look at South Africa, they just see us as just hypocrites, that, okay, these people are hypocrites. They pretend to be the activists of human rights, but they say nothing about what's happening around them, and they come here to make noise about what's happening here. So they see us as hypocrites.
It says if you are an ally, a former ally of the government, you are allowed to get away with violations of human rights. And we as South Africa can be selective as to how and when we choose to condemn human rights. It sends a message of ambiguity and inconsistency. It sends a message that actually African lives don't matter. Another way of putting it would be to say black lives don't matter, given that we must concede that not all Africans are black, but we must recognize that, in fact, this means the message we are sending to the world. And we cannot afford that, given our own history. As Africans, as South Africans, we came from a history of brutality and oppression. We cannot allow it to happen right in front of us. We should be at the forefront of fighting for it. And therefore, whether it is happening in Zimbabwe, whether it is happening in another part of Africa, we must condemn it as we would in any other place. So I'm urging again that South Africa's foreign policy must always be based on human rights. It must be based on trade, and it must be consistent in how it approaches these issues, so that the international community can trust our historically principled position that simply says that an evil across the fence is an evil everywhere, and it in fact affects all of us as Africans.
Very well. Thank you so much for waiting.
Guys, I totally agree with Maimane, man. I totally agree with Maimane. I think that this issue is just exposing us. It is just exposing us. So guys, please, man, let me know what you think. Go to the comment section. Don't forget to hit that like button, and the most important part, subscribe. My name is Thomas Mabaso. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.